In the bitter winter of 1881, while outcasts on the Missouri River huddled in tar-paper shacks, Christopher Hosser dragged his children into an abandoned steamboat hull. The boiler was a dead shell. The iron walls flaked with ice. But Christopher saw a fortress that could trap the wind and turn it into a fireplace. The riverbank called it a frozen coffin. If he was right, it would be the warmest home on the water. Christopher Hosser was no newcomer to hard luck. A former stoker on the riverboats, he knew the Missouri like a brother. But when a series of misfortunes left him and his two children sleeping in the mud outside a saloon, he broke the only rule that mattered on the frontier. He took shelter where no man dared, a half-sunken steamboat stranded on a frozen sandbar. The iron carcass was a death trap, they said. Temperatures inside fell lower than outside. Yet Hosser, desperate and clever, saw what others missed. The ruined boiler could be fired up. The curved iron walls could trap heat like a bread oven. But before he could prove his home was warm, he had to answer a far more dangerous question. Could it survive a Missouri ice flood? That question would be answered sooner than anyone expected. The steamboat's name had long since worn away from the bow, but the river men still called her the Nellie. What was left of the sternwheel still painted a dull, peeling blue. She'd run aground 2 winters earlier during a late-season freeze, when the pilot misjudged a shifting channel and rammed her hard into the sandbar. The company stripped her of anything valuable and left her there, half-sunken, a hazard to navigation unless the warning lantern burned. Inside, the main deck was a cavern of rotting decking and a massive, silent boiler that rose from the floor like a tombstone. The first night, Christopher's daughter, little Sarah, 7 years old, cried so hard her breath froze against the iron plate behind her head. His son Jacob, just turned 9, pulled a thin coat tighter and stared at the dark water that sloshed through gaps in the hull. "Pa, they're gonna find us," he whispered. Christopher didn't answer because the river company had already made it painfully clear what happened to squatters. They dragged out 2 men the month before and left them to walk 60 miles through snow with nothing but a warning and a bruised jaw. By the third morning, cold had become the enemy that didn't rest. The iron hull sucked heat from bodies faster than any wind, and burning driftwood inside a bucket only pushed thin, useless smoke into the air. Christopher had tried packing dried grass between the children's blankets, but by the fourth night their lips were turning blue. He knew that if he couldn't find some source of lasting warmth, he'd lose them both inside a week. Then, while scraping frozen mud from the firehole door of the boiler, he realized what he'd been staring at. The boiler wasn't a decoration. It was 1,000 pounds of cast iron, built to hold steam hotter than any forge, and it still had a working firebox. If he could get a fire going inside it, the entire mass would act like a heat sink, radiating warmth long after the flames died. But firing up a dead boiler without a proper chimney risked filling the hull with smoke. So he spent an entire afternoon cannibalizing deck plates and old pipe to rig a flue through a broken window, sealing it with river clay and moss. The first time he lit the boiler, the change was instant. A deep, dry heat bloomed from the iron belly and rolled across the cabin space in waves. Sarah stopped shivering and fell asleep against a pile of old grain sacks. Jacob sprawled near the door, his cheeks turning pink for the first time in 4 nights. Christopher sat against the opposite wall, listening to the fire rumble, and for one brief moment he allowed himself to think they might actually survive this. That feeling lasted less than 3 hours, because the smoke rising through the makeshift chimney had been spotted from the bank, and by sundown, a lantern was bobbing across the frozen mudflats toward the wreck. The man who ducked through the doorway carried a heavy revolver on his hip and answered to Captain Decker, the river company's enforcer for the middle Missouri stretch. He was built like a flatboat, shoulders wide, neck thick, and his expression said he'd seen enough deadbeats and drifters to know exactly what he was looking at. "You just lit a signal fire on company property," Decker said flatly. "That puts you in 3 kinds of violation before we even get to the stolen coal." Christopher didn't argue. He'd been down on the docks long enough to know that the river company ruled the winter bank with absolute authority. A man could protest all he wanted, but the end result was always the same, a quick beating and a cold walk. But this time, Christopher had something no other squatter had offered. He looked Decker in the eye and pointed toward the iron ladder that led to the upper deck. "You still need a man for the lantern," he said. "I'll keep it lit every night until the thaw." The silence that followed was long enough for Jacob to pull his sister behind the boiler. The lantern was the one reason the company hadn't already torn the wreck apart. Federal river law required any obstacle in the navigation channel to display a warning light, and if that light went dark for even one night, the company faced fines heavy enough to cripple an entire season's profits. The previous keeper, an old drunk named Mullins, had vanished during a cold snap, taking his pay and leaving the light untended for nearly a week before anyone noticed. Decker had been trying to fill the position ever since, but nobody with any sense would live on a stranded hull in the middle of the Missouri winter. The captain studied Christopher for a full minute, then glanced at the two small faces peeking from behind the iron drum. "You light fails even once," he said quietly. "I won't just throw you off this boat. I'll have you arrested for piracy." A thin, humorless smile crossed his lips. "You understand. I'll say you took the vessel by force." Christopher nodded once. That night Jacob held the lantern while Christopher filled its reservoir with the last of the whale oil they'd found in a supply locker. The wick caught, and a pale amber glow spilled across the upper deck, throwing long, dancing shadows across the frozen river. From the bank, the light would be visible for nearly 2 miles, a signal to any riverboat that this sandbar could tear its hull open. But inside the hull, tucked beside the warm boiler, Sarah whispered something that cut deeper than any threat Decker had made. "Pa, is the boat gonna break when the ice comes?" Christopher didn't answer immediately, because she'd named the one monster that kept every riverman awake through March. When the ice breakup began, massive sheets of frozen water would ride the current downstream like white rafts, some as large as barns, crushing everything in their path. The shanties and lean-tos on the bank got swept away every year, and the sandbar itself was directly in the surge path. The only reason the Nellie still stood was that it had been empty, its hull lifting slightly with the water as the ice scraped past. But with a family inside and a fire burning, every variable shifted. If the hull buckled, there'd be no escape. The water would flood the firebox and send a cloud of steam through the deck before anyone could scream. The next morning, Decker returned with a grimy contract that stated Christopher Hosser was to act as temporary lightkeeper at the pleasure of the Missouri River Navigation Company, with no rights, no wages, and no claim to the vessel. Christopher signed it with a stub of pencil while his children watched from the boiler's warm shadow. That was when Decker, with a strange glint in his eye, added one final warning. "Ice Watch says the upper Missouri's already cracking near the Niobrara. You got maybe 12 days before the first flows come through." He looked around the dark iron cavern. "Wouldn't worry so much about the light going out. I'd worry about those walls turning into a crumpled tin can with your children inside." He turned and walked away across the frozen mud, leaving Christopher standing in the doorway, listening to the distant, deep groan of shifting ice that rumbled beneath the winter silence. Christopher stood motionless in the doorway long after Decker's lantern vanished into the black tree line. The ice groan came again, a deep, bone-shifting rumble that traveled up through the mudflats and vibrated through the iron hull like a struck bell. Somewhere in the upper Missouri, the winter was already cracking apart, and when the flows came, they would not drift peacefully. They would ride the current like unsteady barges, rolling, colliding, grinding anything smaller than a cliff to splinters. The shanty dwellers on the bank could run for higher ground. Christopher had no such option. The sandbar was an island, and the Nellie was its only structure. If he abandoned it, they'd lose shelter, warmth, and the lantern contract that gave them the flimsiest legal excuse to remain. If they stayed, the boat could crumple around them in an instant. His children's faces drifted through his mind, and something hardened behind his ribs. He was not going to let this boat die. He was going to turn the river itself into a fortress. The idea didn't arrive fully formed. It started with a memory from his stoker days aboard the paddle-wheeler General Lyon. During a brutal spring flood, the pilot had steered into a narrow levee cut, deliberately grounding the bow on a mud bank behind a rock spur, so that the oncoming ice would slide up and over the forecastle instead of punching through the hull. The boat had lost paint and railings, but the ice had lifted and broken around it. Christopher had watched that from the fire deck, and the image returned to him now with terrifying clarity. The sandbar was his rock spur. But he needed something to lift the floes before they reached the hull, a ramp the ice could not ignore. He needed to build a wall of frozen water, shaped precisely, angled to deflect the river's weight upward. And he had exactly 11 days to build it before the first mass floes smashed through. The following morning, Jacob found his father crouched in the engine room beneath the main deck, prying apart a tangle of rusted pipes with a crowbar. The boiler fire had been banked low, but the warmth upstream from the ash pit still sent dry heat through the corroded metal. Christopher was pulling out every length of pipe that wasn't shattered, every valve that still turned, and all the copper tubing he could salvage from the old condensation lines. He explained his plan to Jacob in simple, serious words. The boiler would heat water drawn from the river, and a hand pump would force it through a hose to the upper deck, where Christopher would spray it onto the frozen mud bar directly in front of the bow. In the sub-zero air, that water would freeze in less than a minute. Layer by layer, he would sculpt a sloped ice apron, a massive, curving ramp that would catch the leading edge of any ice flow and force it to slide upward over the hull rather than crush against it. The geometry had to be perfect. Too steep, and the flows would punch through. Too shallow, and they'd ride up and smash straight onto the deck. The angle was the single thin line between survival and annihilation. The hand pump was ancient, a brass and leather relic that Christopher had found half buried in river silt behind the boiler. He worked it with a rhythmic, swinging motion that he knew would punish his shoulders within hours. Jacob was stationed at the water source, a hole hacked through the ice near the sandbar's edge, kept from freezing over only by constant ladling with an old cooking pot. Sarah, too small for heavy labor, held the lantern when darkness fell and stacked the growing pile of wet rags and old sailcloth they used to shape the ice before it set. By the end of the first day, they had laid a dull white tongue of frozen river water stretching 20 feet forward from the bow, no taller than a man's knee. It was ugly, lopsided, and pitted with air bubbles. But when Christopher pressed a heavy chunk of driftwood against its slope, the wood skidded upward and flipped over the top. The principle worked. The shape now just had to become huge. Days 2 through 5 became a haze of frozen pain. The Missouri air stayed well below zero, so the spray froze instantly on impact, but the work of pumping and shaping never paused. Christopher's bare hands turned red, then white, then gray with frostnip. He wrapped them in strips of canvas torn from an old tarpaulin, but the water soaked through, and his knuckles swelled until he could barely close them around the pump handle. At night, sitting beside the boiler, he would peel the canvas away and hold his trembling fingers to the warm iron while Sarah watched with wide, solemn eyes. He never once complained loud enough for the children to hear. He only said, "6 more layers tomorrow." Then he would sleep for 3 hours and climb back out into the midnight dark to spray another frozen sheet before the morning wind could erode his work. The riverbank took notice. The squatters upstream and the rivermen who lived in the warehouse lofts on Front Street could see the strange white mound growing in front of the wreck. By the 6th day, a loose parade of curiosity had gathered across the channel, staring through the bitter haze at the lone figure spraying water from the bow of a dead boat. Most of them shook their heads. An old steersman named Finch yelled across the open water, "You're building yourself an ice coffin, you fool." A cluster of rough men laughed, their breath puffing white in the air. But one man did not laugh. Silas Kincaid had worked the Missouri since before the gold rush. He'd been a bowman on Mackinaw boats, an ice watcher for the American Fur Company, and had survived more spring breakups than any man alive on that stretch of river. Now in his 70s, he lived in a tiny log shack high on the bluff, where he spent his days reading the river like scripture. When he saw the growing ice formation, he didn't mock. He came across. Silas arrived the next morning, stepping carefully across the frozen sandbar with a gnarled walking stick. His face was a leather map of old frostbite, and his eyes were the pale gray of winter water. He didn't introduce himself. He simply walked around the ice ramp, studying its curve, its thickness, the way it met the muddy sand beneath the snow. He tapped the ice with his stick and listened to the sound. He kneeled and sighted along the slope toward the river channel, where the current still ran black and fast between borders of white. Only then did he speak. "Your angle's wrong, not much, but enough." Christopher, who had been pumping without pause, stopped and turned. Kincaid's voice was low and rough. "You got the front edge too sharp. Big flow hits that edge square, it'll crack your ramp right down the middle. Then the next flow will crush the bow like stepping on a tin cup." Christopher's stomach tightened. "What do you suggest?" The old man drew a long, curved line in the snow with his stick. "Make it rounder, softer slope. You want the ice to roll, not slide. Rolling wastes its strength. Sliding keeps it mean." He stood and looked toward the distant bend of the river, where a low, continuous thunder now echoed day and night. "There's a monster coming, son. I've seen it on the upper gauge. A full season's freeze breaking loose all at once. It'll be like the whole world rolling downhill." He turned and began walking away, then paused. "Fix that curve. You got maybe 3 days." Christopher spent the next 2 days reshaping the ramp entirely. He and Jacob did the calculations in the snow, marking arcs, measuring the curve against the line of the current. The pump handle grew so stiff they had to grease it with pine tar. The new shape was broader, a sweeping convex rise that would meet the ice not with a point, but with a gentle, rolling welcome. He also reinforced the hull itself, using the boiler to heat iron plates salvaged from the ruined paddle wheel housing, and pressing them against the bow from the inside, where they froze into place with a layer of river clay sealing the seams. Sarah helped by bringing frost-covered stones from the bank to weigh down the edges of the ice ramp. Jacob learned to feel the temperature of the iron with his tongue, a trick Christopher taught him to check for cracks. By the evening of the 9th day, the work looked solid and deliberate. The ice ramp was now a massive white breastwork, curving outward from the bow in a smooth, organic shape that seemed almost grown rather than built. From a distance, the steamboat looked like it had grown a frozen prow of its own, but Christopher had no time to admire it. Because in the deep night the thunder upstream suddenly stopped. The river fell silent. Then the first flow hit. It was not large, no bigger than a wagon bed, but it struck the edge of the ice ramp with a sound like a cannon shot. The whole hull shuddered, and Sarah screamed. Christopher bolted from the boiler, seized a padded hammer he kept near the bow door, and rushed outside into the howling dark. The floe had hit the ramp, lifted halfway, then spun sideways and jammed against the northern edge, its weight cracking a jagged wedge out of the carefully curved ice. A second, larger floe immediately crashed into the first, the impact spraying shards across the deck. For one sickening second, Christopher watched his ramp buckle inward. Then he saw the danger. The damaged section was now a sharp, flat face instead of a smooth curve. The next floe would hit it square and likely shear straight into the hull. Without hesitation, he grabbed the pump hose, turned the valve, and began spraying liquid water directly onto the jagged break, even as the two jammed floes ground against the ramp. Ice formed almost instantly, sealing the cracks, filling the gouge. But the crushing pressure of the jammed ice had nowhere to go. The hull began to groan, its iron plates shifting against the sandbar mud. Then, with a shriek of scraping metal, the entire boat slid backward 6 inches on the bar. The jolt knocked Jacob off his feet inside the cabin, and Sarah grabbed the boiler, crying. Christopher never stopped spraying. The new ice bonded the broken section, and then he did something terrifying. He opened a second valve that sent a narrow stream of scalding water directly under the floe, melting a thin channel beneath it. The floe tilted, lost its grip on the ramp, and slithered sideways off into the dark current, freeing the jam. The ramp held. He stood gasping, steam rising from his soaked canvas gloves. Inside the hull, Jacob had pulled his sister behind the boiler and was whispering that Pa would fix it. But above them, through the groaning iron plates, they both could hear what their father was now facing. The main wave had begun. From far upstream, the frozen river was disintegrating in a single, chaotic avalanche. Floes the size of small cabins rolled end over end, colliding, spinning, piling onto each other like white wreckage from a shattered world. The sound was no longer thunder. It was a continuous, ripping roar that swallowed the wind and shook the sandbar. The lantern on the upper deck swung wildly, its flame dipping and flaring. Christopher climbed back to the pump, but before he could touch the handle, a new flow struck. Not the ramp, but the port stern, where the old paddle wheel had been torn away. The unprotected iron buckled inward with a scream of tortured metal, and a crack opened along the seam just below the waterline 6 feet behind the children. Icy river water began jetting into the cabin near the bilge. The bilge pump was dead. If the crack widened, the boat would flood in minutes, dragging the firebox underwater and killing the boiler's heat forever. Christopher turned away from the ramp and ran to the crack, his mind racing. Inside the cabin, Sarah saw the dark water spreading across the floor and began to weep. Jacob grabbed an old grain sack and tried to stuff it into the crack, but the water pressure tore it away instantly. Christopher arrived with a glowing length of iron rod he had been heating in the boiler firebox for just such an emergency. He pressed the rod against the gash, the sizzle of steam erupting around his gloves, but the metal was still too pliable to seal under pressure. In desperation, he wedged a heavy wooden block against the crack, braced one end against the engine frame, and hammered it tight with a mallet, slowing the flow to a trickle. He then wrapped the seam in tar-soaked canvas and wired it shut. It was a stopgap, not a repair. Every slam of an outside flow sent new shocks through the hull, threatening to pop the plug loose. He knew he couldn't hold both battles at once, the bow ramp and the fractured stern. And then, in a moment that silenced even the children, a flow much larger than any before came riding the main channel dead center, turning slowly in the current. It was a monster, a thick blue-white slab at least 40 feet across, with sharp edges bent upward from some earlier collision. It didn't drift. It advanced with the unstoppable dignity of a moving glacier. Christopher watched it come, and the dread that tightened his throat was colder than any river water. If it hit the ramp at the wrong angle, the curve would not deflect it. The weight would drive straight through the ice wall, crush the bow, and push the entire boat sideways off the sandbar into deep water, where the cracking stern would split wide open. He rushed to the ramp's edge, pump hose in hand, desperately spraying fresh water to thicken the impact point. The flow bore down, silent now, its shadow blotting out the stars. The children clutched each other behind the boiler, the lantern guttered, and the deck beneath them began to tremble from the approaching mass. The monster flow struck the ramp not with a single blow, but with a rolling, grinding pressure that seemed to last an eternity. Its leading edge caught the curve exactly where Christopher had reshaped it, and instead of punching through, the massive slab began to rise. The whole bow of the Nelly groaned and tilted upward as the flow slid onto the ice ramp, its immense weight compressing the frozen layers beneath it until they shrieked like a living thing. Christopher stood dead still on the upper deck, one hand gripping the frozen railing, watching the white mountain climb toward him. For a sickening heartbeat, he believed the ramp would fail, and the entire cathedral of ice would crush through the deck and bury his children. Then the flow reached the ramp's apex, its leading edge now 10 feet above the gunwale, and it stopped rising. For one crystal second it hung there, balanced, a frozen cliff suspended above the cabin. Then it tilted, its weight shifting backward, and with a roar that drowned every other sound in the world, it slid sideways off the port side of the hull and crashed into the river channel, sending a wave of black water and shattered ice spraying across the sandbar. The boat shuddered, the stern crack widened another inch, and the wooden plug shot loose under the pressure. Icy water poured into the bilge in a torrent. Christopher scrambled down the ladder into waist-deep freezing water. The boiler fire hissed as spray struck its iron belly, steam billowing into the dark cabin. Sarah's screaming had stopped, replaced by a terrified silence that was worse. He found them crouched on top of the woodpile, Jacob holding his sister with both arms, their faces pale in the flickering light of the lantern that still somehow swung from its hook. "Hold onto the beam," Christopher shouted over the rush of water. He seized the floating wooden block, drove it back into the crack with his shoulder, and this time he wedged it not against the engine frame but directly under a rusted deck beam, hammering it into place with a heavy iron maul. The flow slowed, then stopped. But the water in the bilge was rising still, fed by the earlier flood, and without the bilge pump they would be standing in icy slush until the boat sank or the ice jam passed. Christopher had no other pump. What he did have was the boiler. He had once seen a river engineer use steam to clear a flooded hold. He knew it was dangerous. Pressurized steam could scald a man alive, but the principle was simple. He rigged a length of copper pipe to a steam cock on the boiler's top manifold, ran it down into the bilge water, and cracked the valve. A blast of superheated steam erupted into the freezing water, heating it instantly, forcing it to expand and surge toward the stern where a makeshift drain hole had been hacked through a deck plate. The hot water, now flowing rather than seeping, began to run out into the river through the same crack it had entered. Christopher controlled the steam valve with one hand while the other pressed against the wooden plug to keep it seated. This could not last. The boiler's water level was dropping, and if the steam pressure fell too low, the fire would need to be stoked, but stoking required dry fuel and the woodpile was half submerged. Still, for 10 desperate minutes, the steam bilge pump worked. The water level dropped low enough that the children could return to the dry spot near the boiler, though their feet were soaked and their lips blue. But the ice flood had not finished. Throughout that interminable night, floe after floe hammered the Nelly. Most were small, manageable. A few were large enough to rattle the repaired bow ramp and send tremors through Christopher's exhausted body. He stayed by the boiler, feeding it with whatever dry wood he could salvage, maintaining the steam pressure to keep the bilge dry while listening to the thunder outside. Just before dawn, the artillery roar began to fade. The frequency of impacts dropped. By the time the first pale gray light leaked through the frost-covered windows, the river had calmed to a sullen, grinding murmur. The ice flood had passed, leaving the sandbar surrounded by a maze of tumbled floes and pressure ridges. The Nelly was battered, leaking, but intact. Christopher stepped outside into the bitter morning and saw that his ice ramp was nearly gone, shattered and swept away. But it had done its work. The hull had survived. And then he looked up at the lantern post on the upper deck and felt his heart stop. The light was out. The glass chimney was intact, but the wick had burned down to nothing in the chaos, and the oil reservoir had frozen solid. The warning light had been dark for hours, maybe since before the monster flow hit. The river company's single unbreakable condition had been violated. If Decker didn't already know, someone on the bank would have noticed. It was only a matter of time before a boat arrived with armed men to carry out the threat of arrest for piracy. Christopher stared at the dead lantern, then looked down at his children through the frosted window, huddled together under a wet blanket beside the boiler. He would not lose them because of a burned-out wick. He climbed the iron ladder, ignoring the ice that coated the rungs, and began working on the lantern with bare, trembling hands. The frozen oil had to be thawed. He wrapped the reservoir in a rag soaked from the boiler's hot water pipe. He cut a new wick from a strip of old sailcloth. The glass chimney he polished with his sleeve. When the oil finally began to loosen, he filled the lamp, lit the wick with an ember from the firebox, and watched it catch. The flame steadied, its amber glow once again sweeping across the frozen river like a pulse. From the bank, it would look like nothing had happened, like the light had never gone out. But Christopher knew that someone had been watching. The someone was Captain Decker, who stood on the bluff with a spyglass, having ridden out from Fort Benton at first light to check on the wreck after the ice flood. He had seen the lantern go dark for nearly an hour, and he had seen the desperate scramble to relight it. He folded the spyglass and said nothing to the riverman beside him. Instead, he rowed down to the sandbar alone. Decker found Christopher still on the upper deck, his hands wrapped in blood-stained rags, standing guard beside the relit lantern. The captain climbed aboard, his boots crunching on the crusted snow, and regarded the scene with an expression of cold calculation. The bow was dented, the paddle wheel housing torn further, the ice ramp reduced to rubble. But the boat still floated, the fire still burned, and the children inside were alive. "You disobeyed the contract," Decker said. "The light went out. Christopher did not deny it. He only pointed toward the river where a newly formed channel of open water now curved around the sandbar. The ice flood changed the channel, he said. That shoal wasn't there yesterday. The next boat that comes through will be running blind unless this lantern stays lit. Decker's jaw tightened. He understood river navigation well enough to know it was true. The ice had reshaped the sandbar, making the hazard even more dangerous. Without a lightkeeper, there would be a wreck before spring. But Decker was not a man to be swayed by necessity alone. He was a company man, and the company wanted the boat stripped for salvage, not occupied by a squatter family. "Make your case," Decker said finally. "Why should I let you stay after tonight?" Christopher opened the cast-iron door of the boiler firebox and gestured inside. The flame glowed deep orange, and the warmth that rolled out was immediate. Then he pointed to the crack in the stern that he had plugged and steamed dry. "I fixed that with a wooden block and tar. I rigged steam drainage from the boiler. I built an ice ramp in 10 days that saved this hull from being crushed. No crew from town would have done that for wages. They'd have let her die and collected the insurance." Decker's eyes narrowed. Christopher pressed on. "You need this lantern burning every night. A hired hand would have run at the first ice. I didn't run. My children are still here. I'll keep the light lit through the flood, through the thaw, until the last ice is gone. In return, I want a paper that says this boat is my home, not a squat, legal possession." Decker laughed, a single sharp bark. "You think the company's going to hand over a steamboat to a stoker with nothing but children and a boiler?" But something in Christopher's expression made the laugh die in his throat. The following afternoon, a company surveyor arrived with a ledger and a measuring chain. The man, a weary-looking clerk named Thompson, spent 2 hours inspecting the hull, the boiler, the makeshift repairs, and the lantern. He noted that the boiler was still functional, the hull structurally sound despite the damage, and that the sandbar had indeed shifted, making the wreck more of a hazard than before. He also noted the presence of a bona fide lightkeeper on board, with a contract, however irregular, and 2 children who clearly had no other home. Thompson's report, when it reached the company headquarters, contained a single recommendation that would change everything. "The occupant has demonstrated sufficient competence and necessity. Given the navigation hazard, formalizing his tenure as lightkeeper, with habitation rights, would serve the company's interests better than salvage." But the recommendation also warned that the boat could not be permanently given away without some extraordinary act of public service, something that would demonstrate to the river community that the company was not simply abandoning property to squatters. That extraordinary act arrived 2 nights later. A late-season storm swept down from the north, dropping visibility to 0 and piling fresh ice against the banks. A small packet steamer, the Missouri Lark, was limping downriver with a damaged rudder, her pilot struggling to hold course in the narrow channel. He had no charts for the new ice-dredged shoal, and the snow obscured every landmark. The boat was veering directly toward the sandbar, its running lights invisible in the white gale. 23 passengers and crew were aboard. From the upper deck of the Nellie, Christopher heard the distant, desperate ringing of the Lark's bell and saw the faint blur of its cabin lights moving in the wrong direction. He ran to the lantern, cranked the reflector wide open, and then did something that no river manual prescribed. He tied a length of tar-soaked rope around the lantern post, lit it with the lamp flame, and sent a bright, burning flare shooting upward into the snow. The pilot of the Lark saw the sudden blossom of fire, recognized it as a warning, and wrenched the wheel hard to starboard, narrowly clearing the sandbar and grounding gently on a soft mudbank a quarter-mile downstream instead. No one died. The passengers sent a letter of gratitude to the company, and the pilot testified that the lightkeeper's improvised flare had saved them all. That was the act of public service Thompson's report had required. On the first day of real thaw, when the river began to open and the first grassboats appeared on the banks, Captain Decker returned to the Nellie with a sealed paper. He handed it to Christopher without ceremony. It was a quitclaim deed transferring possession of the wrecked steamboat Nellie to one Christopher Hosser, in consideration of his service as lightkeeper and his actions in preventing a maritime disaster. The document was legal, witnessed, and stamped with the company seal. Decker watched as Christopher read it, his face betraying nothing. Then the older man said, "You're still living in a rusted hull on a sandbar, but it's yours." He paused. "Don't make me regret this." He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Christopher stood in the doorway of his boat, the paper trembling in his calloused hand, while Sarah and Jacob pressed close to read it over his shoulder. The words were official and cold, but they meant one thing simply. Nobody could ever take their home away again. The ink was still wet on the deed when the river delivered its final verdict on who belonged where. 3 nights after the Missouri Lark was saved, a secondary ice surge boiled down the channel, smaller than the first, but driven by a sudden thaw that sent meltwater roaring from the headwaters. The shantytown on the bank, built from driftwood and tar paper, had no defense. The flow line hit the mud flats like a battering ram, splintering lean-tos, folding sheds, and dragging a dozen makeshift homes into the black current. Men ran with their families, some carrying children on their shoulders, running for the bluff. By morning the bank was swept clean, a field of shattered planks and drowned fire pits. But in the middle of the river, a thin plume of smoke rose from the Nellie's chimney. Christopher stood on the bow, Jacob beside him, watching the debris drift past. Their home had not moved an inch. The ice ramp was gone, but the hull had ridden the surge, its iron plates ringing like a bell, the boiler still glowing. Sarah stood in the doorway behind them, wrapped in a patched wool blanket, and said what they all knew. The boat didn't break. That morning, the survivors from the bank began wading through the slush toward the sandbar. They needed warmth, dry ground, a place to regroup. Christopher met them at the gangplank with a pot of hot water and a stack of old sailcloth blankets. There was no room inside, but the upper deck was clear and the boiler's warmth radiated through the iron ceiling. Soon a ring of shivering men and women sat around the deck, their faces lit by the lantern that had never gone out again. They stared at the solid hull around them, the thick plates, the curved walls that had deflected ice. A woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who had lost her shack and every stick of furniture, looked at Christopher with wet eyes. How did this hold when everything else did? He could have given a long answer about iron, about curves, about the ramp he'd built. Instead, he pointed to the boiler. Fire and metal, he said, and a place to keep them together. By the time the river settled for good, the Nellie had become a landmark no longer avoided. It was a destination. The rivermen who once mocked him now called it Hawser furnace, and not unkindly. In the months that followed the flood, Christopher began transforming the boat from a shelter into a true home. He repaired the stern crack with heavy iron plates salvaged from a sunken barge, bolted and caulked with oakum. He built a brick hearth around the boiler, its chimney now a proper stack that drew smoke cleanly upward, while radiating heat into both the main cabin and a new sleeping loft he'd framed beneath the deck beams. The walls he lined with layers of canvas and old newspapers, then covered them with pine boards from a wrecked flatboat. The windows he glazed with sections of thick bottle glass set in lead, salvaged from a river trader's discarded cargo. By November, the cabin was not merely warm, it was genuinely comfortable. On the coldest nights, the children slept in their loft with the heat rising beneath them, while Christopher sat in his chair by the boiler, reading a tattered almanac by lantern light. The garden came the following spring. Christopher hauled wheelbarrows of river silt onto the afterdeck, built raised planters from old decking, and planted potatoes, beans, and turnips. The steam condenser he'd rigged to the boiler provided fresh water, dripping into a barrel. The heat from the boiler kept the planters thawed on frosty nights. By summer, green shoots covered the stern, and Sarah would stand there each morning, watering them with a tin cup while tugboats passed. Passengers on the riverboats would point and wave at the strange sight of a garden blooming on an old wreck. The lantern, too, was never lit with oil alone again. After the night it died, Christopher built a backup system, a small reflector mirror behind the flame, and a second wick that could be ignited instantly from the boiler's pilot light. The light never failed. Every night its glow swung across the channel, guiding boats around the shifting sandbar. Pilots began to rely on it. Some would blow their whistles as they passed, and Jacob would blow back a shrill note on a handmade whistle. Silas Kincaid, the old ice watcher, returned each spring to sit on the bow and tell stories. He would bring fresh-caught catfish and a jug of blackberry wine, and he and Christopher would talk late into the night about river currents, ice patterns, and the madness of men who thought they could fight nature. One evening, Kincaid said something that Christopher would repeat for the rest of his life. "You never beat the river," the old man said, staring into the firebox glow. "You just learned to float higher than most." He gestured at the iron walls. "And you built yourself a boat that already knew how." Time passed. Jacob grew tall and strong, his father's quiet competence settling into his bones. He learned to read the Missouri's moods by the color of the water and the shape of the ripples, and he became the boat's unofficial pilot, pawing a small skiff out to guide strangers through the tricky channel when the fog rolled in. Sarah, who had once cried at the cold, became the keeper of the garden and the one who remembered every face that ever crossed the gangplank. She kept a journal, old ledger pages from the ship's original logbook, filled with her careful handwriting, recording the names of travelers, the dates of storms, and the recipes for the stews that simmered on the boiler. The lantern log she also maintained, marking each night's lighting with a neat checkmark. After 3 years, there were over 1,000 marks, and not a single gap. The River Company, mindful of the Lark rescue and the unsinkable lighthouse, made an unprecedented offer. They would pay Christopher a modest monthly stipend of $12 to remain as lightkeeper, with the deed now permanent and hereditary. The Nellie would be officially registered as a navigation station, its lantern marked on pilot charts. Christopher accepted, and for the first time in his life, he had not only a home but an income. He used the money to buy real window glass, a proper stove for cooking that burned the driftwood more efficiently, and leather boots for the children. He also bought a heavy anchor chain, which he wrapped around the bow and buried deep in the sandbar, so that even if a flood lifted the boat, it would remain tethered like a cork rather than drifting away. Then came the flood that proved the chain's worth. In the spring of 1885, the Missouri rose higher than anyone alive could remember. Rain in the mountains and a rapid melt pushed the river over its banks, submerging the entire floodplain. The town of Fort Benton itself was threatened, buildings on the lower streets filling with muddy water. The Nellie, sitting on its sandbar, began to rise. Christopher felt the deck shift beneath him and knew instantly what was happening. He told the children to stay on the upper deck, grabbed the anchor chain and double-checked its shackles. The water roared beneath the hull, lifting the boat a foot, then 2 feet, then 5. The entire vessel bobbed gently on the surge, the chain groaning but holding. From the shore, people watched in astonishment as the wreck that had been written off as scrap rose and floated like a living ship. For 2 days, the river raged, washing away every structure built too close to the banks. But the Nellie, now a true boat once more, simply rode the flood. When the waters receded, it settled back onto its sandbar exactly where it had been, the garden mudded but intact, the boiler still warm. That year, the town newspaper sent a correspondent. The article that appeared in the Fort Benton Record described the Hosser home as a marvel of frontier ingenuity, a floating homestead that defied ice and flood alike. The writer noted that the interior was as snug as any parlor in town, with a stove, comfortable bunks, and a small library of donated books. The story circulated along the river, and the Nellie became a symbol of stubborn survival. Other squatters began salvaging old barges and hulls, trying to replicate the Hosser design, though none quite matched the warmth of the iron-shelled boiler house. Christopher never sought fame. He continued lighting the lantern each evening, tending the garden and mending the hull. When asked how he had done it, he would simply say, "You don't need to be rich if you've got a good fire and a roof that won't blow away." In the winter of 1891, an old riverman stood on the bluff above the river and studied the Nellie through a spyglass. The lantern glowed steady. Smoke rose straight from the chimney. Below deck, a man in his 50s, his beard now gray, was teaching a young woman, Sarah, grown, how to trim the wick. Jacob was on the afterdeck splitting firewood with an axe. The riverman lowered his glass and turned to his companion. "That man built the warmest home on the Missouri out of a dead boat and a hot rock," he said, and not a single winter has ever taken it from him. The companion asked if Hauser was some kind of genius. The riverman shook his head. Just a man who listened when the river spoke. Most people only hear the noise. He heard the instruction. And as the sunset caught the lantern's light, the Nelly sat quiet and permanent, its hull now encrusted with years of river silt, but its heart still glowing, the only home on the water that had never lost a fight with the ice. But the river never forgets a man who truly understands it. For 3 decades, Christopher Hauser lived aboard the Nelly, raising his children and later his grandchildren on that same sandbar. Visitors who stepped into the cabin would often remark that it felt less like a salvaged wreck and more like a warm stone cottage. The boiler, by then lined with river bricks and crowned with a cast-iron cooktop, served as both furnace and kitchen. The walls, patched so many times, had become a mosaic of different metals, each scar telling the story of a winter survived. And every evening, without fail, the lantern glowed. Sarah eventually married a boat builder from Fort Benton and settled downstream, but she returned every Christmas to sit by the boiler and listen to her father tell the story of the ice flood. Jacob took over the lightkeeper's duties when Christopher's hands grew too stiff, and he added a fog bell salvaged from a snagged ferry, its deep ring echoing across the channel on misty mornings. The garden on the afterdeck became a small legend of its own, fresh vegetables growing from a steamboat in the middle of the Missouri. Travelers would bring seeds from as far away as St. Louis, and Christopher would trade potatoes for coffee and news. This is the part of the story where most would expect a tragic end. The river, after all, is not gentle, and frontier lives rarely end in peace. But Christopher Hauser passed quietly in his cabin in 1902 at the age of 67, while the boiler hummed softly beside him. He was not wealthy, but he owned his home outright, and his children were strong and free. The river eventually reclaimed the Nelly decades later, its iron hull rusting into the sand, but by then the Hauser name had spread across the territory, attached not to luck but to a stubborn, quiet wisdom. The real question that lingers is not whether Christopher was brilliant. It is what the rest of us would have seen if we had stumbled upon that frozen hull with 2 shivering children and no prospects. Would we have seen a coffin, like the rivermen warned? Or would we have seen a boiler waiting to become a fireplace, iron walls ready to hold the heat, and a lantern that could earn a legal claim to the only warm home on the water? The difference between a grave and a sanctuary sometimes comes down to a single decision, whether to fight the cold or to learn its shape and turn it into shelter. If stories like this remind you that resilience is built from what others discard, then subscribe and ring the bell. History is full of forgotten men and women who never conquered nature but made peace with it, and their stories deserve to be told, because the warmest homes are rarely the ones built with the most money. They are the ones built with the most wisdom.